I was 3 weeks into a ceramics fellowship in Oaxaca when my brother used our late father's woodworking shop to secure a business loan he had no intention of repaying. I found out the way you find out about most betrayals in my family, not from the people who did it, but from a stranger who assumed I already knew. The contractor's name was Hector. He called my cell because the number was still painted on the shop window in my father's handwriting. He wanted to confirm demolition timing. He was polite, professional. He said he was sorry to bother me and asked if Thursday worked or if Friday was better. I said, "Thursday for what?" He went quiet in the way people go quiet when they realize they're the one delivering news that was supposed to come from somewhere else. I told him to stop, not to touch anything. He said he'd need to check with the new owners. I said the words back to him slowly, like if I heard myself say them out loud, I could figure out what they meant. New owners. He gave me a name. I recognized the LLC. My brother had been talking about it for 2 years. I didn't call my brother first. I called my mother first. I called my mother. Some reflex, some old training. She picked up on the second ring and said, before I could speak, "I was going to tell you when you got home. My name is Rosalind. I'm 32. I'm a ceramicist, which means most people at family dinners ask me if I make mugs, and I say sometimes, and then we both pretend that answered something. My father was a furniture maker, not a hobbyist, a craftsman. He had a shop in the back of a building he owned outright in a neighborhood that used to be industrial and is now the kind of place where people pay $22 for a cocktail and call it character. He built the shop from salvaged lumber when I was 4 years old. By the time I was 10, it smelled permanently of raw walnut and linseed oil. By the time I was 20, it was the only place I knew where I felt like I was supposed to be there. He left it to me when he died, not to my brother. Not split between us. To me, specifically, in a will he had a lawyer draw up 6 months before his diagnosis turned from manageable to not. He left my brother the house and a savings account and a truck that had 140,000 miles on it and a bent antenna. He left me the shop and the building it sat in and a note that said, "You already know what to do with this." I did know. I was running it as a shared workshop space, renting benches to other craftspeople, teaching weekend classes, using the back corner for my own kiln and wheel. It wasn't making me rich. It was making me whole. There is a difference, and my family has never been able to see it. My brother's name is Prescott, but everyone calls him Scout. He is the kind of person who has always been about to do something great, not doing it. About to. There's always a deal closing next month, a partner coming on board, a pivot that will change everything. My parents talked about him the way you talk about weather you're hoping for, always just over the horizon, always promising. I was the other kind of thing, the one who had already done something, but the something I'd done didn't photograph well at Christmas. Ceramics, a workshop, a fellowship here, a residency there. My mother told her friends I was an artist, the same way she would tell them someone had an unusual diet. Technically accurate. Mildly inconvenient to acknowledge. We had an unspoken arrangement. I was useful. I helped. I didn't ask for recognition as long as they left my work alone. It held for years. I thought it would hold forever. The fellowship in Oaxaca broke the pattern by removing me from it. For 6 weeks, I was unreachable in the ways that mattered. I was focused. I was in a studio with other people who thought about clay the way I thought about clay. No one called me to ask if I could cover Scout's car payment because he was between things. No one needed me to be practical or available, or the kind of daughter who keeps everyone from noticing what isn't working. I worked until my shoulders lopped up. I started a series I'd been sketching for 3 years. Vessels about belonging, about weight, about what gets handed down and what gets dropped. I was 2 weeks from finishing when Hector called. I booked a flight for the next morning. My mother called 4 more times before I boarded. I let them go to voicemail. My brother texted once. It said, "This is a business decision. Please try to be rational." I read it in the terminal and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The building looked the same from the street, which was disorienting. I had expected it to look like what it was, robbed. Instead, it just looked like a Tuesday, scaffolding on the south wall. A dumpster at the curb with clean edges that told me it had just been delivered, a new lock on the shop entrance that my key didn't fit, A man in a vest with a company logo came around the corner. He had a clipboard. He looked at me the way contractors look at women standing in front of job sites, patient, preemptive, already sorry. I told him who I was. He pulled up something on his tablet. Change of ownership filed 8 weeks ago, he said. We've got permits through the end of the month. I didn't sign anything, I said. He looked at his tablet again. Then he looked at me. There's a signature on file. There is a particular sensation of finding out something was done to you while you were somewhere else, living your life, trusting that certain things were too foundational to need protecting. It doesn't feel like anger right away. It feels like the floor tilting. Like the building you're standing in front of is actually much further away than it looks. I called my mother back. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting. You need to calm down before we talk, she said. I was standing on a sidewalk in front of my father's building with a new lock on the door. I was not calm. I told her so. Scout needed collateral, she said. Real collateral. The investors required documented assets. This was the fastest option. It's my building, I said. It's a shop, she said. Same correction, different inflection. And you weren't here. I was in Mexico for 6 weeks, not dead. You're always somewhere, she said. And I heard it for what it was, the collected grievance of every time I had ever chosen my work over availability, condensed into 3 words. You forged my signature, I said. Silence. Not denial, the other kind. We'll talk when you're not like this, she said, and hung up. Scout called that evening. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of my storage unit, where someone from the shop, God bless her, one of my regular renters named Odessa, had managed to move several of my most irreplaceable tools before the locks changed. Scout called and I picked up because I needed to hear him say it. He said it, not apologetically, explanatorily, as if the facts of what he'd done were so reasonable that my reaction was the thing requiring justification. The timeline was tight, he said. You weren't reachable. I had a phone. And the opportunity required proof of assets by a specific date. Mom and I talked it over and agreed this was the best path for the family. It's my property, I said. Dad left it to me. It's workspace, he said. You can do your pottery anywhere. There it was, the family's universal consolation prize. You can do that anywhere. As if what I'd built there were just the activity, and not the decade of my life I'd pressed into the walls of it. Scout, I said, I need you to understand something. I'm not calling to negotiate. I'm calling so that when this is over, you can't say you didn't know. He laughed. Not unkindly, which was somehow worse. The laugh of someone who is confident they're holding all the cards. It's already filed, he said. It's done. Okay, I said. I hung up and called an attorney. Her name was Constance. I'd met her 2 years earlier at a gallery opening. She collected functional ceramics. She had opinions about glazing that were genuinely informed. And a mutual friend had mentioned offhand that she was the kind of lawyer people called when something had been done to them that shouldn't have been possible. She dealt in property and estate law. She didn't flinch at things. I told her everything in about 15 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which I was grateful for because I wasn't sure I could stop and start again. She said, send me the original will, the deed, and any communications you have from your family about this. Don't talk to them again without me. I sent everything that night from a motel near the building. She called at 8 the next morning. There are 2 problems with this transaction, she said, and her voice had the tone of someone reading something carefully. First, the obvious one. The signature is forged. That's fraud. That's a criminal matter, not just a civil one. And the second? I asked. The second is more interesting. She paused. Your father was careful. The deed has a restricted transfer clause. A lot of older craftsmen who owned shop properties put them in. I see it occasionally. It specifies that the property cannot be transferred, encumbered, or used as collateral without both a specific procedural review and the consent of the named beneficiary. It was designed exactly to prevent this situation. I sat there. So the loan, the collateral is defective, she said. The lien Scouts LLC placed on the property was based on a transfer that couldn't legally happen, which means the loan is secured by something that was never his to offer. What does that mean for the lenders? It means they have a significant problem, and so does Scout. She filed that morning, emergency injunction, fraud notice to the county recorder, formal notification to the lending institution that the collateral instrument was void, stop work notice to the contractor. My phone started ringing at noon. I watched the screen light up with my mother's number 6 times, then my brother's twice, then my mother's again. I let them ring. They came to the motel the next evening. I hadn't told them where I was staying, which meant they'd tracked my phone through the family location sharing app I had forgotten to remove myself from when I got back to the country. That detail said something about how they thought about the word mine when it applied to me. My mother knocked. I opened the door because I was tired of feeling like I was hiding. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me my whole life when I was doing something she found inconvenient. Not angry, exactly, more like mildly baffled that I would choose this when there was a perfectly good other option available to me. This injunction is going to cost your brother his funding round, she said. He committed fraud, I said. We did what we had to do for the family. I had heard that sentence before. It has always meant we did what we wanted for Scout, and you were part of the family only in the sense that you were present and therefore usable. Scout was behind her. He looked worse than I'd expected, gray around the eyes, that particular exhaustion of someone who has been running from a consequence and just felt catch-up. He stepped forward past my mother. Rosalind, he said, I need you to withdraw this. No, you don't understand the position I'm in. The round closes in 9 days. If the lender calls the note Scout, I said, I want you to think about what you're asking me to do. You forged my name. You used a property our father left to me, specifically to me, as collateral for a loan you took out to fund a business I had no part in. And now you want me to fix it. I'll pay you back, he said. When the company exits, when, I said. He swallowed. I made a mistake in the timing, in how it was handled. But the underlying logic was sound. The underlying logic, I repeated. I let that sit for a second. Why didn't you use the house? Dad left you the house. He didn't answer. My mother's eyes moved to the window. There it was, the answer in the silence. The house was theirs. The shop was mine. The shop was the one they felt entitled to treat as communal, because my work had always been the category of thing the family borrowed against without asking, not because they didn't value the shop, because they didn't value it as mine. You owe me, Scout said. His voice had changed, that flatness of someone dropping the ask and moving to something uglier. You always come through. That's who you are. I looked at him and felt something I can only describe as a kind of clarity that comes from finally seeing a pattern complete itself. He wasn't wrong that I always came through. He was wrong about what that meant. He thought it was a character trait. It was conditioning. And I was finished with it. Call Constance's office, I said. Anything else goes through her. My mother stepped forward, her voice shifting into the softer register she used when she wanted something badly enough to pretend she was asking for it. Rosalind, please. He could lose everything. He could lose something he built on a lie, I said. That's not the same. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression moved through something I couldn't quite name. Not anger, not grief, something harder to categorize. Then she said, You're being selfish. I had heard that word aimed at me my entire life whenever I declined to be the solution to someone else's problem. It used to land. It used to make me reshape myself immediately, tighten back into usefulness, apologize for having a perimeter at all. I held the door open. Good night, I said. The storage unit was on the east side of town, past a stretch of warehouses that hadn't been converted yet. I went the next afternoon alone, with the key Odessa had thought to grab before the locks changed. It was a small unit. Everything was stacked with more care than the circumstances warranted. My kickwheel in the corner, the base wrapped in packing blankets. 3 crates of finished work from the last 2 years. My father's wooden jointer that I'd never used because I wasn't a furniture maker, but that I had kept because he'd made it himself, and the fence had his handwriting on a strip of masking tape, a measurement he'd jotted down in 1987 and never removed because it was still right. I put my hand on the masking tape. The handwriting was in pencil, faded at the edges. This was the thing they had never understood, my mother and Scout, not because they couldn't, but because they hadn't tried. The shop was not storage. It was not a financial asset that happened to be in my possession. It was the place my father had built with his hands and then entrusted to me with his. And that handoff was the most real thing that had ever happened to me and my family. Every other thing had conditions on it. Love contingent on usefulness. Approval contingent on not needing too much. That transfer of the deed was the only thing that had ever said unconditionally, "This belongs to you." They had taken it and signed my name to the taking. My phone rang. My mother, I let it ring. It rang again. Scout. I let it ring. Then a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I did. It was someone from the lending institution's legal department. He was careful on the phone, not hostile. They had received Constance notice and were reviewing the collateral documentation. He had some questions about the timeline of my absence and return. I answered his questions. He thanked me and said they would be in touch. I hung up and stood in the storage unit for a while longer, my hand still on the jointer, the pencil measurement fading under my palm. There was grief in there. Not the kind that makes you cry immediately, the kind that comes from finally letting yourself feel the shape of something you'd been refusing to touch. Not just the shop. The whole architecture of how I'd lived in that family, the way I'd made myself small and available and endlessly fixable so that the space I occupied wouldn't get challenged. The bargain I hadn't realized I was making. I stayed until the fluorescent light in the unit started to buzz, then I locked it and drove back to the motel. The hearing was 3 weeks later. My mother wore her good blazer. Scout's knee moved continuously under the table, a clock counting down to something. Constance didn't perform. She presented the restricted transfer clause, the forged signature, confirmed by a handwriting analyst, which she mentioned once flatly and moved on from. The defamatory letter included in the sale packet. I had not known about this part until Constance showed it to me the week before, in which my mother had written a letter to the developer describing me as emotionally volatile, financially irresponsible, and likely to contest any transactions related to the property out of spite rather than legitimate claim. It recommended that any agreement proceed over my objections. I read it at Constance's desk and felt my face go very still. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't entirely, and that was its own kind of information. The judge's questions got quieter and more precise as the session progressed. He had the careful attention of someone doing arithmetic. When he issued the stop work order and voided the collateral instrument, the sound Scout made was not quite a word. My mother sat with her chin up, performing a composure that was doing visible work. Outside, my mother tried once more. She fell into step beside me on the courthouse steps, and her voice dropped to the register she uses for private things. "You humiliated your brother," she said. I looked at her. Not with anger. I had used up the anger somewhere in the 3 weeks between the motel and the hearing. What I felt was more like distance. The specific distance that opens up when you finally stop trying to close it. "He humiliated himself," I said. "I just didn't cover it up." She stopped walking. I kept going. The loan collapsed. Without valid collateral, the lender called the instrument and the funding round fell apart. Scout's investors withdrew. The investigation into the forged signature moved forward on its own timeline, separate from Constance's civil filings, which meant my brother spent the next several months in the particular misery of not knowing exactly how bad it would get. My parents stopped calling once the civil matter resolved. They sent a card at some point. Not an apology exactly, more of an account of their perspective, written in my mother's careful cursive, explaining the position they'd been in and the decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time. I read it twice and put it in a drawer. The restricted transfer clause, once the transaction was unwound, also did something else. Because the attempted transfer had violated the clause, it triggered a legal protection my father had apparently built in quietly. A provision that locked the property from any further encumbrance attempts for 15 years, tied to my sole ownership. Constance explained it to me sitting at her desk, and I had to ask her to repeat it. "He planned for this?" I said. "I think he planned for the possibility," she said. "Craftsmen who own property in up-and-coming neighborhoods see a lot of family pressure to monetize. He wanted to make sure the decision would always be yours." I went back to the shop for the first time on a Tuesday in November. The walls were partially stripped. The south wall had been opened up partway before the stop work order hit, and the old plaster was exposed in a long diagonal scar. The light still came through the west windows the same way, low in the afternoon, crossing the floor in a wide parallelogram that moved toward the back bench as the hours passed. My father had oriented the workbenches to catch that light. I had rearranged them twice and both times moved them back. I stood in the middle of it and waited to feel something definitive. What I felt instead was something quieter, not triumphant, not healed, just present in a way I hadn't been in a long time, not managing anything, not anticipating what the space might be used against me for, not preparing to be useful, just standing in a room that was mine because my father had understood something about me that the rest of my family had never bothered to. I brought my wheel back from the storage unit that week. I set it in the back corner, where it'd always been, plugged it in, and centered a piece of reclaimed clay I'd been saving. My hands found the rhythm without thinking about it. The shop still smelled like linseed oil and old wood. Under that, just barely, the earthy mineral smell of wet clay joining it. There is a thing that happens when you center clay correctly, when the pull and the pressure are exactly balanced, where the mass stops wobbling and goes still in your hands, not passive still, alive still, spinning true. I thought about my father's note. You already know what to do with this. He wasn't talking about the building. He was talking about what I knew how to do when people stopped taking things from me. I kept throwing until the light left the windows. Nobody needed me to be anywhere else. Nobody had a claim on this hour except me. I left a piece to dry on the shelf my father had built in 1992 next to the window that faces west and drove home in the dark. There's something that happens in families when one person stops being the thing everyone else leans on. The structure that existed because of you doesn't disappear. It just becomes visible for the first time. You see the weight that had been on you. You see the spaces that had been filled by your willingness to be filled into them. My mother would call eventually. My brother would send something that was almost an apology. We would have some version of a relationship because that's what families do. They renegotiate, they recalibrate, they find the new geometry. But the shop was mine. The deed was mine. The masking tape with my father's handwriting was mine. The light that crossed the floor in November was mine to stand in without justifying it to anyone. That was the thing they had tried to take, and the thing they had tried to expiate, and the thing they had failed to understand they could never actually own. You can't sell what was never yours to touch. I've thought a lot about the masking tape, that strip of yellow tape on my father's jointer, the one with his pencil handwriting from 1987, a measurement he wrote down once and never bothered to remove because it was still accurate almost 40 years later. That's what I kept coming back to in the weeks after the hearing. Not the courtroom, not Scout's face when the judge ruled, not even the moment I walked back into the shop for the first time. Just that tape. Just the fact that my father wrote something down carefully, trusted it would hold, and it did. There's a cause and effect to everything, and I don't mean that in any cosmic or religious sense. I mean it in the plainest, most human way. What you build carefully tends to outlast what someone grabs quickly. My father built carefully. He built the shop with salvage lumber and his own hands. He had a lawyer draw up a deed with a restricted transfer clause. He wrote a note and left it where I would find it. He did all of this knowing, I think, that the people who loved me also had a habit of treating what was mine as communal property the moment it became useful to them. He wasn't bitter about it. He just planned for it. That's what I've been trying to learn. The intelligence of preparation over reaction. Scout moved fast and assumed speed was the same as power. He thought that if the transaction happened while I was far away and the paperwork looked right, the reality of it would just settle into place and I'd come home and absorb it the way I'd absorbed everything else my family had decided without me. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong had nothing to do with luck. It had to do with the fact that my father had been more careful than Scout anticipated, and I had found an attorney who was more thorough than he planned for. What you do when no one is watching is what actually determines things. My father had no idea if the clause would ever matter. He put it there anyway. I built a community around that shop. Real renters, real relationships. Odessa, who thought to grab my tools before the locks changed because she cared about what we built together. None of that was an accident. All of it paid forward when it mattered. And then there's the harder part, the part I'm still working through. For years, I kept the peace by being useful. I absorbed, I adjusted, I made myself small enough that my existence wouldn't create friction. I thought that was love. It wasn't. It was a transaction. And like Scout's loan, it was built on collateral I was supplying without being asked. The moment I stopped Constance's office, everything else goes through her. I didn't lose my family. I found out what had actually been there the whole time. That's not a comfortable thing to discover, but it's a real thing, and I'd rather have real than comfortable. That took me a long time to be able to say honestly. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just what you find still standing after everything else has been tested. My father's handwriting on a strip of masking tape, still right after 40 years. That's what I'm trying to build now. Carefully, without urgency, in the light that crosses the west windows every afternoon the same way it always has.